My husband and his mother never knew I understood a single word of Korean. For 28 years, they spoke openly in front of me, believing I was completely in the dark. And then, at his mother's 80th birthday celebration, surrounded by 60 of their closest family and friends, I heard something that made the room go cold around me. What happened next changed the entire course of my life. Welcome to Twisted DST Stories. Before I take you into this, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from today. We have listeners from coast to coast, and we love hearing from all of you. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. I met my husband at a university alumni mixer in the spring of 1991. I was 27 years old, finishing my second year as an elementary school teacher in Hamilton, Ontario. He was handsome and polished, the kind of man who knew exactly how to hold a room. His name was David, and he had grown up in a tight-knit Korean-Canadian family that had settled in the Mississauga area in the late 1970s. His mother, whom everyone called Uma, had come over from Busan as a young woman and had built her life entirely around her family. She spoke very little English, and what little she did speak, she used only when absolutely necessary. David courted me the way men in old films court women. He brought flowers to my apartment door. He remembered that I took my coffee with 1 sugar and a splash of oat milk before oat milk was fashionable. He told me I was the most quietly strong woman he had ever met, that he admired how dedicated I was to my students, that he had never felt so at ease with anyone in his entire life. I believed him completely, because I was 27 and I wanted very much to believe in something. He proposed at Niagara-on-the-Lake on a cool October evening in 1992, and I said yes without a single hesitation. I was 28 years old, and I remember thinking I had found the great love of my life. The first sign that something was off came at our engagement dinner at Uma's house in Mississauga. It was a large gathering, aunts and uncles and cousins filling every room, and throughout the evening, Uma and David would drift into Korean together, long stretches of conversation that would end when someone glanced my way. I asked David once, quietly, in the kitchen, what his mother had said about me. He kissed my forehead and told me she said she was glad he had finally found someone settled. It felt like a strange way to phrase a compliment, but I let it go. After we married and I moved into David's house in Oakville, I began to understand the architecture of the life I had walked into. David made good money as a commercial real estate developer. The house was in his name alone because he had owned it before we married, and in the early years of our marriage, when I asked about putting my name on the title, he explained in a calm, reasonable tone that it was simpler this way, that it protected us both for tax purposes, that I shouldn't worry about things like that. I was 29 years old and I trusted him, so I stopped asking. Uma visited 3 or 4 times a week. She had her own key, which David had given her without mentioning it to me first. I would come home from school to find her reorganizing my kitchen cupboards, moving things to where she felt they made more sense, leaving notes in Korean on the counter that I couldn't read. When I mentioned to David that I'd prefer a little notice before she came by, he looked at me with something between disappointment and disbelief. "She doesn't have many years left with us," he said. "She just wants to feel useful. Is that really so hard for you to accept?" I accepted it. I accepted a great many things in those early years. The criticism came the way water carves stone, slowly and without drama. David would taste something I had cooked and mention that his mother made the broth differently. He would look at what I was planning to wear to a family event and suggest something more conservative, more appropriate. He would review the grocery receipts I left on the counter and ask why I had chosen that brand instead of this one, why I had spent that much on something we could get more cheaply somewhere else. He wasn't loud about any of it. He was always calm, always reasonable. That made it harder to argue with, harder to even name. We tried for children for 4 years. We went through testing, 2 rounds of IUI, a round of IVF that ended in a loss at 8 weeks. After that, David went quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. He had always imagined a large family. His brothers had children, his cousins had children. At every family gathering, he would watch the little ones running through the house with an expression I could feel from across the room. Uma never said anything to me directly about it. She would simply speak to David in Korean after those gatherings, long, murmured conversations in the car or in the kitchen, and David would be short with me for days afterward. Once I asked him what she had said. He told me it wasn't something I needed to concern myself with. After we stopped trying, David suggested I leave teaching. He said I was exhausted, that we didn't need the income, that I should focus on the home and on my own well-being. I had been teaching for 11 years by then. My students, my colleagues, the rhythm of the school year, these things were mine in a way that nothing else was. I told him I wasn't ready to give it up. He didn't shout. He simply became less available, less warm, more occupied. The coldness lasted until I submitted my resignation. I told myself it was a sabbatical, that I could go back whenever I chose. I did not go back. The years folded into each other the way they do when the days are all alike. I cooked and kept the house and attended David's work functions and his family dinners, and I smiled when I was supposed to smile. David took care of all the finances. Our joint account received a monthly transfer from his business account, enough to cover groceries and household needs, and I managed on that. I had no credit card in my own name. When I needed something beyond the monthly amount, I asked, and David would consider it and usually agree, but the asking was its own kind of diminishment. I was 56 years old and I had to ask my husband if I could buy a new winter coat. And David would sit in our living room in the evenings and speak in Korean, and I would busy myself with something in the kitchen or the garden. I had come to think of their language as a wall I simply lived beside. Some walls you stop noticing after a while. I was 56 when something shifted inside me. I had driven to the Oakville Library one gray Tuesday morning to return a stack of books, and on the community board near the entrance, a small printed flyer caught my eye: Korean language classes for adult beginners. Wednesday mornings, 10 until noon, at the community center on Kerr Street, free of charge through a cultural exchange program. I stood in front of that flyer for a very long time. Something moved in me that I had thought was gone, a small ember of something I could only describe as wanting. I took a photo of the flyer with my phone. I walked to my car. I drove home, and then I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes thinking about it. David knew I went to a Wednesday morning watercolor class at the community center. I had been going for 3 years. The watercolor class met at 9, and it was usually finished by 10:30. I had never mentioned to David exactly how long it ran. The following Wednesday, I stayed after watercolors and walked down the hall to the Korean class. There were 12 of us that first morning: a retired nurse, a man who had adopted a daughter from Korea and wanted to be able to speak with her birth family someday, a young woman engaged to a Korean-Canadian man, and the rest of us who had our own quiet reasons we didn't speak aloud. Our instructor was a woman named Soo Jin, patient and warm, with a gentle way of correcting that never made you feel foolish. I was by far the most awkward student in the room. My tongue had forgotten how to take on new shapes. The syllable blocks of Hangul swam in front of my eyes. I left that first class feeling like I had tried to run a race with legs that had been asleep for 30 years. But I went back. I went back every Wednesday. I listened to Korean radio podcasts while I gardened. I downloaded language apps and practiced during the 20 minutes after David fell asleep at night, phone face down on my stomach, earbuds in, volume low. I bought a Korean-English dictionary and kept it in my car under the driver's seat. I borrowed Korean novels from the library and sat with the translation app open beside them, reading a page at a time like someone piecing together a puzzle in the dark. I told no one. Not my sister in Sudbury, not my closest friend. The secret was the point. For the first time in decades, I had something that was entirely mine, something that lived outside the walls of this house and this marriage and the careful, managed life I had been handed. I held it close like a match cupped against the wind. A year passed, then another, then a third. By the middle of the third year, I could follow a Korean drama without subtitles. I could read a news article and catch most of it. My speaking was still hesitant, still accented, still slow, but my comprehension had quietly become something close to fluent, and I began to understand what I had been living beside for 28 years. It started small, overhearing tell David that I had seated the guests at his cousin's wedding reception incorrectly, that anyone with real social sense would have known the family placement. David agreeing easily, laughing a little, saying yes, she doesn't always read a room. Then larger things. Telling him that she had spoken to his cousin Henry about investing a portion of the family money somewhere that my name would never appear, because you never know what a person will try to claim later. David saying that was smart, that he had already moved a portion of his development income into an account at a different bank that I didn't know existed. I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in my hands, listening through the doorway, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. Not the dramatic kind of shift you see in films, the quiet, clarifying kind. The kind where everything you thought was uncertain becomes suddenly, horribly clear. I kept listening. I kept learning. I said nothing. I also, quietly, began educating myself in another direction. On the days I was at the library, I started reading about Ontario family law, the Family Law Act, the concept of equalization of net family property, the rules around matrimonial homes. I learned that in Ontario, even if a matrimonial home is owned in one spouse's name, the other spouse has an equal right to possession and a claim to equalization. I learned about the Canada Pension Plan and how spousal benefits work after long marriages. I sat in the library reading these things the way I had once sat in university reading things that would shape my entire future, because that is exactly what this was. I did not tell David I was doing any of this. Uma's 80th birthday fell on the last Saturday of September. David planned the celebration with the same thorough, organized energy he brought to his work. He rented a private room at a Korean restaurant in Mississauga that Uma had loved for 40 years. He arranged for 60 guests, family from Toronto and Brampton and Markham, and a few who flew in from Vancouver. He chose what I would wear, a sage green dress he said was appropriate and flattering for a woman my age. I nodded and put on the dress. The evening began gently. Toasts were made. Photographs were taken. The food came in waves, dish after dish that Uma had requested specifically, and she moved through the room with the ease of someone who has always understood that these gatherings exist to honor her. I sat at the family table and smiled and spoke with the cousins whose English was good and let the Korean flow around me like it always had. Toward the end of the meal, David and Uma stepped away from the table together. They moved to a quieter corner near the window, and something about the purposefulness of it made me watch them. I excused myself from a conversation with David's aunt and made my way toward the gift table nearby, close enough to hear, with my back turned to them. Uma was speaking about the house. She said that it was past time to transfer the title into a trust that named David's nephews as the eventual beneficiaries. She said she had spoken to a lawyer friend of the family, and he had confirmed it could be done without my consent, since my name was never on the title to begin with. She said it should happen soon, before things get complicated. David said he agreed. He said he had been meaning to deal with it for a long time but had kept putting it off. Uma said something then that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said she had always known I was not the right woman for him, that I had come into the family with nothing and contributed nothing beyond keeping the house tidy, and that when the time came, I should receive only what the law absolutely required and not $1 more. She said she had watched me for 28 years smile and nod and make myself small, and that a woman like that had no one to blame but herself. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's never once pushed back. Not once in 28 years. I think she genuinely doesn't know what she's entitled to." Uma laughed softly and said that was probably true. My hands were completely still. I noticed that, the stillness of them. The dish towel I had been holding 2 hours earlier in my kitchen had been replaced by a champagne glass, and my hand around it was perfectly steady. Inside me, something that had been building for 3 years, for 28 years, reached a kind of completion. A door closing on one side and opening on another. I set down the champagne glass on the gift table. I turned around. I walked toward them calmly, the way you walk toward something you have decided. Uma saw me first. Her expression shifted from surprise to the careful neutrality she had always used with me. I spoke to her directly, in Korean. I said that I had heard everything she said, and that I wanted her to know I had understood Korean for the past 3 years, and that I was grateful she had spoken so openly tonight because it had given me everything I needed. The silence that opened around those words was one of the most complete silences I have ever heard. David's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which I had seen before. Uma put her hand flat on the table as if she needed something to hold on to. David said my name. Just my name. The way people say a name when they have run out of everything else. I told him, in English, that I had understood their Korean conversations for 3 years. I told him I knew about the second bank account. I knew about the conversations with Uma's lawyer friend. I knew what he had said about me, what she had said about me, what they had planned for the house that was also my home. He said my name again. He said I was upset, and we should go outside and talk about this privately. I looked around the room. The room was listening now, the way rooms do when the temperature changes. 60 people, most of them his family, turning toward us with the confused attention of people at a gathering who suddenly realize the gathering has changed. I had not planned to do what I did next. I had imagined this moment in many versions over the past 3 years, and in most of them, I walked away quietly and made my calls to a lawyer the following morning. But 28 years of being managed and arranged and spoken over in a language I was not supposed to understand had left something in me that needed more than a quiet exit. I raised my voice enough to carry. I said that I wanted the people in this room to know that for 28 years, my husband and his mother had used Korean to say things about me that they would never have said in my presence if they had known I could understand. I said that tonight, at his mother's birthday celebration, I had heard them make plans to remove me from any inheritance of the home I had lived in for nearly 3 decades. I said that I had heard his mother say I had contributed nothing and deserved nothing. I said that I was 60 years old and I had given the better part of my adult life to this family, and I was done being invisible inside it. There was a sound in the room that was not quite gasps and not quite silence, but something between the two. David grabbed my elbow. He said this was not the time or the place. I stepped back from him. I said to him, clearly and without raising my voice further, that there would be no time or place after this, because I was leaving. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair. I picked up my bag. I walked through the restaurant toward the front door. David's cousin, Young Ji, a woman who had always been kind to me in a quiet, careful way, followed me out to the parking lot. She said she was sorry. She said she had heard things over the years, things said at family dinners that had made her uncomfortable, and she had not spoken up, and she was sorry for that. I thanked her. I asked if she could drive me to my sister's apartment in Etobicoke. She drove me without another word about it. My sister Carol had been telling me to leave for 11 years. She had a spare room with a good mattress and thick curtains, and she had kept it available for me the way you keep something available for someone you love and are frightened for. She opened the door that night and looked at my face, and held me in the hallway for a long time before she said anything. What followed was not simple. Nothing about the end of a long marriage is simple, and I will not pretend otherwise. David went through phases in rapid succession over the weeks that followed. He called, he emailed, he appeared at Carol's building twice, and had to be asked by the concierge to leave. He told me I had humiliated him in front of his entire family and that he would never forgive me for it. Then he called and said he couldn't live without me and asked me to come home. Then his lawyer sent a letter stating that since the matrimonial home had been owned solely by David before the marriage, I had no claim to it. I had already spoken to a family lawyer in downtown Toronto by then. Her name was Sandra, and she was thorough in the way that makes you feel, for the first time in a long time, that someone is genuinely in your corner. Sandra explained to me that, in Ontario, the Family Law Act is very clear. The matrimonial home is treated differently from all other property. Even though David had owned it before our marriage, because it was the home we shared as a family, I was entitled to an equal right to possession, and it was included in the equalization calculation. She explained net family property, the deduction of premarital values, the way assets are tallied at the date of separation. She told me that the account David had moved money into, the one I had overheard him mention, would need to be disclosed in his financial statement, and that any deliberate movement of assets to avoid equalization was something a judge would look at very seriously. She also explained that after a marriage of 28 years, spousal support was not a question of if, but of how much and for how long. We can also look at CPP credit splitting, she said. After a marriage this length, you're entitled to a share of the pension credits accumulated during the marriage. I had spent 28 years believing I had no financial standing whatsoever. I learned, sitting in that office on King Street West, that I had considerably more than I had been led to believe. The process took 10 months. David's initial position was aggressive, then became less so as Sandra's team traced the financial picture more completely. The secondary account he had moved money into. the property in his brother's name that had been purchased with funds from David's company during our marriage. The lawyer friend Uma had mentioned who had, it turned out, drafted a trust document that a judge would not have looked on kindly at all. The settlement was finalized in the summer of the following year. The matrimonial home was sold, and I received my equalization payment from the proceeds along with the other marital assets. I received spousal support for a defined term, enough time for me to reestablish myself professionally. I received my share of the CPP credits. For the first time since 1992, I had a bank account in my own name, credit in my own name, decisions that were mine alone to make. I bought a condominium in Burlington. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony that faces west, and in the evenings the light comes in at an angle that makes everything in the room look like it has been painted. I have a garden plot in the building's community garden, and I grow tomatoes and basil and a small border of lavender that I cut and hang to dry in the kitchen. It is a quiet life, and it is mine in a way that nothing has been mine since I was 28 years old. I renewed my Ontario teaching certificate. It required some upgrading, some additional coursework, but I completed it. I am now working 2 days a week as a supply teacher at an elementary school in Burlington, and I am reminded each time I walk into a classroom that this was always part of me, that it did not disappear, only waited. I still practice my Korean on Wednesday mornings. I am in an intermediate class now, with Soo-jin still teaching. My speaking has improved considerably. Some weeks I stay after class for tea and conversation, and I laugh at my own mistakes freely, in a way I could never have done inside that house. Carol came with me to pick up my things from Oakville on a Tuesday morning after the legal transfer had been signed. We moved through the rooms together, and I was surprised by how little I wanted to take. I took my books, my watercolor supplies, the winter coat I had finally bought for myself 2 years earlier, the photo albums from before 1992, and a small wooden box that had been my grandmother's. I left everything else. Standing in the driveway, waiting for the car, I looked at the house one last time. It was a nice house. It still is, I imagine. But I had never been able to breathe properly inside it. I breathe fine now. Last spring, David's cousin Young-ji sent me a message through email. She said she had run into David at a family event and that he seemed diminished in some way she found difficult to describe. She said that Uma had blamed him bitterly for not noticing that I had learned Korean, that she had told anyone who would listen that his carelessness had cost the family significantly. The irony of being accused of carelessness by the woman who had engineered the whole architecture of their deception was apparently lost on Uma. Young-ji said his brothers had distanced themselves from him after certain financial details emerged during the legal proceedings. She said he had sold the Oakville house and moved into a condominium near his office. I read her message at my kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me, looking out at the light on the balcony. I thought about the version of myself who had stood in a church in Hamilton in 1992 and said her vows with her whole heart, who had believed in that man so completely that she handed him the steering wheel of her life and sat quietly in the passenger seat for 28 years. I do not spend much time being angry anymore. The anger served its purpose. It kept me warm during the cold months of the legal process. But anger is expensive to maintain. And I have things I want to do with my energy now. What I think about more often is the Tuesday morning in February when I stood in front of that bulletin board at the library and took a photograph of a flyer for a Korean language class. I was 56 years old, and I had not learned anything new in a very long time. I had told myself it was too late for that certain parts of a life close off after a certain point, and you simply accept the shape of what remains. That Tuesday morning, something in me refused to accept it. The thing about learning a language is that it teaches you something about yourself alongside the vocabulary. I learned Korean in stolen half hours, in the dark with earbuds in a car parked in a library lot, at a kitchen table with my phone face down and the dictionary open. I learned it in secret, which meant I learned it entirely for myself, with no one else's approval required. No one else's assessment of whether I was doing it correctly or quickly enough or in the right way. It was the first thing I had done entirely for myself in 28 years, and it unlocked everything else. My advice to anyone listening who finds themselves in a situation that has made them small is this: you do not need to have a plan. You do not need to know what the ending looks like. You only need to find one thing, one small, private thing that belongs entirely to you, and you need to protect it and nurture it and let it grow. Because the skills we build in secret, the parts of ourselves we refuse to give away, those are the parts that carry us out the door when the door finally opens. I thought it was too late for me. I thought 60 was the wrong age to start over. I thought that the woman I had been at 28, curious and independent and full of plans, was gone for good. I was wrong about all of it. If you are out there right now, sitting in a kitchen that doesn't feel like yours, or lying awake making yourself small in a space that should feel like home, I want you to hear this. It is not too late. The door is there. You can open it. That is my story. If it meant something to you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Twisted DST Stories for more true stories from everyday people who found their way through extraordinary circumstances. And remember, no matter how long you have been waiting, it is never too late to come back to yourself.